Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 1. This is a pretty basic chapter in regards to how communication is handled. So this is titled The Elements of Communication, and you'll review this in your first chapter of your book, of course. So make sure you take a look at that, read through it. It's a pretty easy book. I wouldn't say it's pretty extreme in its detail, but it's got enough information in there to have a broad overview, of course, of the material you need to know. So this one, PowerPoint, is not too much in depth, and it's pretty easy to follow. So as we talk about communication, there of course is 3 different types of communication: oral communication, written communication, and nonverbal communication. You'll find that your book and other sources describe nonverbal communication as the most constant communication. And it's a way to express your feelings sometimes when oral and written communication is not quite as honest. Oral communication, of course, is via, like we're communicating now. Written communication, usually on paper, typed or written, of course. And, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Feelings are pretty clear when we talk about nonverbal communication, and I think everyone's pretty much aware of the first 2, oral and written, but make sure you understand nonverbal and its importance in communication overall. So what is the purpose to communicate? Period. Why do we communicate? Think about this a little bit, and then we'll answer that question. So hopefully you gave this some thought. So the purpose of communication, of course, is to do the following things: to inquire, to inform, to persuade, or to develop goodwill, or, a type of, bonding, you could say, between 2 or more people. I think there's other purposes of communication we won't really get into, and you might have thoughts in your head at this time of differences in these 4, but this is what the book overviews and what you should know for this course. Some components of communication, of course, is a message sender, the actual message transmission, message receiver, and message interpretation. So the person that sends a message, of course, is the person that's talking or writing. The actual message might be different than what is intended, or the actual message might be intended but not said. When we talk about nonverbal communication, if you say "I'm fine" but scream it, of course it doesn't probably mean that you're fine. There's some differences there. Message transmission, of course, is how you're communicating the message. The person that receives it, of course, is the person that hears the transmission, that reads it, or that sees the nonverbal communication. And then, of course, interpretation, like we mentioned before, different than the actual message. Like, how do they perceive your communication? If you type something in all caps, for example, it might be interpreted as yelling. However, the person that sent the message to begin with might not have meant it in that regard, in that fashion. So the way we communicate, I think it's super important to realize and to put yourself in the different components of this, so you understand when you, say for instance, write a paper, the way you write it, and what you try to put out there needs to be evaluated before you document things. So your audience should be known, and you should know what you're writing about, because that's super important. Of course, therapeutic communication is in healthcare. Quite often we see people that are in need of this, especially in struggling times or in struggling, avenues of life, I guess you could say. So positive feedback at times can be something that's needed. Negative feedback is out there quite often, as we approach a new year, of course, or as we're in a new year. You could say that positivity is really needed because of the prior year's negative components. So I think people often look for it, especially in media and different outlets, and a lot of times it's not there. So as a method of therapeutic communication, I think healthcare is something that you all need to focus on. And when you're communicating to your patients, make sure you display of course, the needed information, what you're supposed to, but you also display it in a way that's positive and reflects good nature towards your healthcare practice and your patients. I thought this was a pretty interesting little PowerPoint slide that was in the material, but it has to do with knowing trust internally and not knowing trust internally. So it develops a diagram of external and internal trust and what that would look like based on a camel being outside a window and blind. So if you look, you don't trust someone externally and you don't trust them internally, of course you're not going to be able to see the camel. And if you trust them internally and you trust them externally, then of course the blind's going to be open, and it'll be easier to describe the camel based on their thoughts and actions. So this is just a little idea of how we trust and what's needed on an internal or an external basis. So if it's open, of course, this is a diagram of that, things we know about ourselves and we know others know about us. This is just a questionnaire about the camel. I would highly suggest you read over it. Hidden would be things we know about ourselves and others don't know. Blind would be things we don't know about ourselves but other people do. And then unknown would be things no one knows about us and we don't know about ourselves. So that just highlights a little bit more of the camel theory. It's pretty interesting. A lot of people use this, and especially in psychology, to determine what is needed to communicate and then how do we communicate it, because if it's not known by either party, it's hard to communicate. But at times we can figure out a way to gauge our listeners and make sure to help them get on a level where they understand where certain areas or issues are coming from. Some further factors that influence communication, of course, the background of a receiver. Where are they from? How do they communicate in their past? The appearance, of course, if you show up to a presentation and you're not dressed appropriately, or you look kind of disheveled and like you don't care about what you're doing, that definitely can provide a negative impact to your performance and how people perceive you. Physical, emotional, nonverbal, and slang are all other areas of influence and communication that we should be aware of, and of course emotional as well. Probably the most important part of the slideshow is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, another psychological type ordeal. It's studied quite a bit in psychology, but self-actualization, esteem, love and belonging, safety, and psychological needs are all areas that should be met in our communication. Let's start with self-actualization, morality, creativity. Those would be two. Esteem would be self-esteem, confidence, and achievement. Love and belonging would be friendship, family. Safety would be security of yourself, employment, and resources. And then psychologically, of course, breathing, food, water, sleep, all that kind of stuff that plays into your needs as a human. So the responsibility, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of need, to evaluate each communication situation, understand their personal needs, so interpersonal, of course, Maslow's hierarchy of need, how do you communicate with someone based on their needs, as we described in this pyramid, assess the receiver's needs, and then apply interpersonal skills. So the way you communicate to one audience might be different than the way you communicate to another audience. I think that's really important to realize and to know as you move forward in this course. Furthermore, 4 skills in communicating: listening, speaking, reading, writing. This further says if only half the pair operates effectively, something is lost in the communication process. So, communication is not kind of one and done. It's something that needs to be completed on all levels, and it's important that you realize that this is essential and this is something that you should know and be aware of. So when you use the elements of communication together, they help reinforce each other, and understanding is gathered on a pro rata basis between the two parties. And then listening skills, I think it's really important. Lastly, listening can be different elements. Make sure you pay close attention to the person that's speaking, of course, and then knowing something about the subject improves your listening. So if you're talking to me about nuclear fission or some high-end science, of course I'm not going to be able to understand that because I have no knowledge on that subject. But if you're talking to me about healthcare and healthcare administration, I want to have an easier time understanding and listening and following you. So this is really saying that that's important and essential when you're communicating to a certain audience. Some barriers to listening, of course, would be educational, environmental, and emotional. We won't go into a lot of detail on that because we're coming to the end of this presentation, but make sure you look at that. Communication can flow upward, lateral, and downward. Make sure you read over that in your text. It's not something that's really going to be used in an exam for you, because there's not but one exam at the end of the course, and it's going to be kind of broad-based. But make sure you understand and know about the flow of communication based on the text of your book. And then business communication, internal and external. How do you communicate with people inside your organization versus how you communicate with people outside your organization? Those are the two differences. That's really the broad overview of Chapter 1. I would say the majority of you should have already heard this type of stuff before, especially if you read the book. It should be a review for you. Don't stress too much about the material. If you have some questions, reach out to me at any time. Happy to help. Thanks for all your hard work. Make sure you do your discussion post and your homework for this week. And otherwise, if you need anything, let me know. Thanks so much.